All right, good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming. I'm just going to ask Luke if you could sign into the Zoom and bring up the 2007 land use section that we asked people who were here last time to take a look at and see if there are any recommendations for changes to that. And I know we have new people joining us here today, but one thing I did want to do is people who were here last time, just ask you your general thoughts after taking a look at that 2007 land use plan section. What are some overall changes or modifications or additions that you think you'd like to see? And for those that are here, I will pass out a copy of that section so that you have it in front of you, and Luke will bring it up online. What I'd like to do is ask either Brian S., Brian W., or Andy to volunteer to go first. And I guess what I'll do is I'll call on Brian S. since he's here and I can see him right in front of me.
My biggest takeaway was just not having enough connection and familiarity. Like, I have no idea from the 2007 plan, like what's been actually accomplished and what still hasn't been accomplished, I mean, so everything I have is just kind of, secondhand hearsay and my own personal observations. I looked at the first objective under adequate land use and I'm like, did we actually accomplish or accommodate large scale industrial employment? It doesn't seem like that's something I've seen beyond what we had before. I'm on goals and objectives. Number 1, adequate land base, resource protection. Under the objectives, I feel that the 4th objective is really important, ensuring that the future development is located and designed to protect full range of, and I think that's been worked at, and I want to continue to see it being worked at and being the 2nd, strong central city, the objectives of having the city's core remain viable and attractive option. I feel like I've seen a lot of progress in the last 14, 15 years. But I still think there's possibly more to do. I'm really interested in objective 3, encouraging employment housing densities that will support a viable transit system. I mean, in 20 years, we are not going to be driving gas cars as much as we are now. I mean, I just can't see it. So what do we do to provide a efficient and environmentally sane transportation system? And how do we plan for that? So those are my thoughts on those first 2, those objectives.
Wonderful, thank you. Andy.
Hi, good morning. I guess, going over some of the objectives and looking over the current existing land use. I look at this map and I'm just like, okay, where is the best opportunities of industrial, residential? Obviously, there's areas inside the city that, we could see bigger housing or more housing. But I'm sitting here studying this and I'm just like, okay, where is our best opportunities to, add new, industry and small businesses and stuff. So that's where I'm like struggling with this a little bit, just figuring out where our best places are to go.
And you're getting ahead of yourself and actually kind of forecasting where we're looking at actually going between this meeting and the next meeting. We did ask a little bit at the last meeting about, so we asked the committee, for those who weren't here, 2 things. First of all, what's your big land use idea? in
Mhm.
terms of what you see happening in Winona's future. What is something that you see would be beneficial for Winona into the future? And there were various responses to that. Basically, to summarize, better use of land that is on the east end, currently used for parking,
Mhm.
or as a parking lot, but maybe excess institutional land, if institutions have excess land that could be redeveloped or reused. Different areas that could be, if they're wetlands or if there's some type of natural restriction, going through the process to be able to potentially fill those wetlands or create more developable property in the same manner as what happened east of Mankato with all of that development a number of years ago. So those were some of the
Yeah.
ideas. And we did, the second question was, okay, those are good ideas in terms of your big idea for future land use, but what are some areas of opportunity? And we talked a little bit about that as well. So
Yeah.
definitely, I think we'll be talking about that and fleshing things out a little bit more, not only later on in this meeting, but in the coming meetings as well. So thank
Yep.
you, Andy. And I'll ask next, Brian Woodley, if you would share with us some of your thoughts on the 2007 section.
Yeah, I honestly don't see much room for change at all. I think most of these ideas are still on point. It's all about implementation and in the market driving when these things are going to happen. So any changes, the right land uses, I think, are applied to these areas. I mean, I'm struggling to find anything that really needs changing. I think where changing needs to come is in zoning and incentives for the things in the comprehensive plan to be done. So, I mean, as far as the comprehensive plan, maybe some updating and some modernization just due to how things have changed. But the ideas for the zones and the areas, I think, are still valid from what you have here. Did I lose audio or is everybody just quiet?
No, my microphone wasn't on.
Okay.
So everybody here heard me, but those online didn't. What we have done is some pretty good work in and around the downtown area, rezoning to match the comprehensive plan, as well as in areas that are just adjacent to the downtown that were previously neighborhood commercial and have been rezoned to mixed use neighborhood. In addition to that, we've definitely utilized the plan in a number of rezonings between 2007 and now. I was able to identify a number of projects that the future land use map that we're looking at right now was crucial in getting those projects approved, essentially, and getting the classification of the land use changed. And so that's where this map really comes into play. When people come in and they're looking for a rezoning, this is the map we kind of look toward to help guide that process. So thank you, Brian. And I do agree. I think a lot of this is pretty pertinent here, and it does come down to implementation, definitely. Next, Tanya, if you would share with us some of your thoughts on the 2007 section, please.
I agree with what Brian said. In reading over it, it all sounds like really good objectives to continue on into the future. And I would agree that we have done a lot of work, or there's been a lot of work done strengthening the downtown area and the central part of the city. I do think that neighborhoods, particularly probably neighborhoods closer to central and west end of Winona, are maybe an area where we could look at because of just the lack of business and things like that in those areas. So probably some zoning or something incentive to try to get businesses to go that area. And then I would agree with what was talked about earlier with transportation as well. As I said, I work at Winona Health, and if I learned anything yesterday, with the change in the road construction, is that transportation in and out of Winona on this end of town is one way only. And it needs to kind of be looked at a little bit, I think.
That is the beauty of our grid system, when you have it at your disposal. So when you have alternate streets, it's nice to have them. All right, and I think that does it for people that were here last time. But for those new faces, I did want to give you the same opportunity just to share with us a little bit about, not only what brings you here, but kind of what's your big idea, or what's your big land use idea, or thing that you think you'd like to see change into the future related to land use in the city of Winona. I know that's a big question, but just share with us whatever comes to mind right off the top of your head. So.
I would agree with all the previous comments. If we're looking at a 20-year plan, it seems to me that we should also be looking at land that we don't currently have. And I'm speaking specifically of 43 and the top of the hill. That's right.
Okay, so when I look at this map, and I bring this from, I bring what I'm going to say from business, that I think about efficiencies. Okay, where are we being efficient with our land use now? And I think certainly there are efficiencies in our downtown core and our fringe and surrounding residential neighborhoods for efficiencies. And I think primarily of housing density. Certainly we'd want to have the market incentives there for more dense housing where those opportunities exist in neighborhoods, whether it's older housing stock that's removed and then replaced. And I'm not sure how that immediately happens, but looking at this picture here, Winona's an island, right? And we're not going to we're not going to knock down those bluffs. We're not going to create more land out in the river. And so that's a question I'm always asking. It's a question I'm asking myself in my business. Am I using my resources, my people, and my physical building to the most efficient use that I can? And so I'd want to apply that here when we're talking about land use. Are we really being efficient? And I suspect there are probably some efficiency opportunities that we could gain with the immediate core land that we have. That'd be just a concept I'd bring.
Is it on? I'm on the Board of Adjustments. And so every couple of weeks we get people. I'm on the Board of Adjustments. So every couple of weeks we get people to come in that want to use their land differently than what it's intended. I think we have to increase our flexibility. We only have so much land. We only can do so much with it. And we only have one way to go, and that's south, as Mike said, up Highway 43 and up County Road 44. Without that, we're kind of stuck. And yes, we can reuse the land we have on the island better, but we've got to be able to have more uses for it. Right now we're locked in with zoning, in my opinion, where it makes impossibility to do some things. And I think we have to be able to look at projects individually, just as we do with the Board of Adjustments, where we go, okay, this doesn't exactly meet the rules for the zoning, but in fact, it makes sense for the area. I'll give you an example. Right now, we have to have front half of commercial buildings downtown. That may not work anymore. We may have to be able to allow parking or something underneath the building rather than a storefront. We just have to look at things and I think be more flexible. Does this in fact make sense? We did 3 subdivisions here in town, high density townhouses. We need to look at that again too, but we need to find an area to build it in. And again, I just look at flexibility as really being the big one.
Definitely. Thank you, John. Appreciate that, everyone. All right. Next, I want to transition a little bit to.
Sorry, this is Nathan. I jumped on a little late. I apologize.
Sorry, I didn't see you there, Nathan. Go right
It's
ahead.
okay.
Thanks
Yeah,
for raising your hand.
Yeah. Playing nurse duty this morning. My 5-year-old just had his tonsils out, so we're juggling a few things. But a couple thoughts I had on that comp plan, and I don't know exactly where these fit in, but I've worked in development in St. Joseph and St. Cloud is a good example, and more recently in Wausau, Wisconsin. And one thing that they both have that Winona, I think, could use, and I don't know how to phrase this and fit this into the plan, but I would say they have a more aggressive port authority, sort of a quasi private public partnership, where they're more aggressive about going after sort of dilapidated buildings and buying them up and assembling parcels and sort of taking a big picture look at the community and say, what does this community, what opportunities does it have? And maybe they don't even know what opportunities it has, but say, let's take this building, for example, like the National Chemical Building that was on the market for 3 years and it was $100,000, but it's because it's going to cost more to tear down than it's worth. So take buildings like that, for example, that there's opportunity there, bring those into this public-private partnership and sort of sit on them and wait and assemble them, so that sort of what the city did with the Hardee's block. I mean, look how great that looks now. Yes, it took 10 years or 20 years, but a great example of a huge success for the Port Authority. So is there a way that our Port Authority can maybe get a little more aggressive, or I don't know how that Port Authority is funded, but is there a way to throw some of this COVID money into the Port Authority to allow them to further their mission a little more aggressively? So that's number one. Number two is someone else just mentioned this, but I do think some of the zoning regulations need to be looked at a little bit. And I'll give another example. Is I have a friend of mine that owns a beautiful Victorian house downtown, and there's a lot of those. And his has a carriage house, and his carriage house, technically, he can't lease it out, or they can't even use it because of some of these rental rules, even though it's been a carriage house with somebody living in it for, probably since the 1800s. So I agree that take a little bit harder look at some of these accessory use structures and making those rules a little more flexible, so that people can use structures they have and maybe consider adding a unit on top of their garage for extra revenue in the future if they want. That's what I got. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Appreciate it. And I apologize. Before we move further, Rick, I would like to give you the opportunity to, I know you're new to the Planning Commission and relatively new to Winona, but in the time that you've been here, what is your kind of big idea or your idea related to land use in the future of Winona?
Well, my focus is more on the central downtown core. I think there are opportunities there. I appreciate historic preservation to a limit. I mean, there are properties that are deemed to be historic that could maybe be put to better use without the restrictions of what the historic preservation means on those properties. But I also understand historic preservation is important as well. I would just reiterate the flexibility that John talked about a little bit, and that Nathan talked about a little bit. Particularly addressing Nathan, the rentals restrictions that we put on it. In my opinion, if a property is owner occupied and they have rental properties, that shouldn't count against the 30%. I mean, like he said, building something on top of your garage to create revenue should be allowed to that person. without it counting against the 30% restriction. So just some of those things are the first things that kind of come to mind when I think about it.
Perfect. Thank you, Rick. I appreciate that. And yes, I think the existing plan that we have right now to a degree, and really the existing zoning that we have right now provides quite a lot more flexibility than you'd think, but I definitely think that there's areas where it could be improved upon. And so what I want to focus on and turn our attention to now is the map that's up on the screen. And really, this is going to be one of the key documents that comes out of this subcommittee, which is the future land use plan. And so what the future land use plan does, and I can hand out a little bit larger 11 by 17 copies. And really, I think the best way to access this is either to come into our office and talk to Luke and I about it. And I have a really big map in front of me right now at City Hall that makes it easier to see what designations and what colors apply to different areas of the city. Either that or take a look online and in our area where we put all the reference materials for the subcommittee. Clicking on this, it's a PDF, and then zooming in. So being able to get in close and take a look at what designations apply to what areas of the city. So for instance, if we're taking a look at the intersection of Highway 61 and Highway 14 here, you can see how the different coloring applies to general areas at and around that intersection. And so one of the key things in interpreting this map is taking a look at the categories, of course. And the categories are down at the bottom. We have a number of different land uses. Everything from downtown mixed use, which of course is focused on the downtown area, the fringe district, continuing on with commercial uses, mixed use, transportation utilities, then going into residential classifications as well as semi-public and institutional. And an important thing that I would really like people to focus on between this meeting and the next meeting is taking a look at these categories and how they apply to certain areas in the city. So briefly, what I'd like to do right now is go through the categories and just provide examples of where they are located, just to give you a brief introduction as to not only what they are, but where they are located. So first of all, we have, and I apologize for those who are watching online, there's going to be a little bit of scrolling here. So first of all, we have the downtown mixed use, and this is what our comprehensive plan does. If you advance for those that are here right now to the descriptions, which are immediately after the maps on page 12. What we have for each land use designation is a description of that designation. And the first one on page 12 is that downtown mixed use. And downtown mixed use basically talks about a different, first of all, some descriptions of the land use categories, and then some comments on the density, intensity, and design. And these are things that these bullet points, actually, we rely on these quite heavily when taking a look at rezonings and taking a look at, does this specific rezoning that's being requested align with the comprehensive plan? And so understanding the interplay between those, that not only do we have these future land use categories, but we also have some details about those categories that in 2007 we thought were really important. So what I'd like committee members here to do is to take a look at these categories and, whereas before we were looking at, goals, objectives, and the overall plan, take a look at these categories, where they're located, and those specific bullet points, and see if there's things that should be added or deleted or changed. I'll give a couple examples here as we work through this. But for instance, in the downtown mixed use area, if you're taking a look at some of the density, intensity, and design, under redevelopment and rehab opportunities, maybe a modification to that bullet point would be allowing more flexibility when it comes to, as John was mentioning, some of that first half of the building retail in certain areas outside of our traditional retail corridors. Think 3rd Street, think Main Street, think portions of 2nd Street. So are there areas that are designated downtown mixed use, which I'll bring up on the map here, that are outside of those core retail corridors that could have more flexibility when it comes to use on the first floor, so that you don't have to have that commercial or retail use on that first floor outside of those core areas. So the downtown mixed use area and the downtown fringe, they work well together. And the downtown mixed use is really the core of downtown. The fringe is an area supporting the downtown. And these are the two areas that we looked at quite a bit with our 2017 update of the zoning code. And I'll zoom in on those real quick here. Bear with me. So those areas, if we zoom into the map, are shown in the purple and the pink. So really we're looking at the core of downtown being between Huff Street and Franklin Street, and then the fringe extending slightly out to Broadway, and then to the east and west of Huff Street and Franklin Street. So you see how those classifications apply to physical pieces of land on our map. The same goes for the other classifications. Yes, the crosshatch is right here. That's a historic district. Yep. Yep. And I'm not necessarily going to go through all these because I think it would take up a lot of time, but just so you know that that's how that works. So you have the map that has the color and the name of the district, and then you have the description on the following pages. So neighborhood commercial is next, following down through general commercial, business park, limited industrial. Then you get into the industrial classifications as well as mixed use. And then you get into classifications that would apply to some of our expansion areas. I have a couple of points that I want to hit on here, but it looks like Luke wants to say something.
I did want to draw attention to, while we're looking at this land use map, some of the comments that we just heard at the start of this meeting were things related primarily to execution. So the land use map is an underpinning for the zoning map. And the zoning map does have those things like lot area minimums, parking requirements, setback requirements, lot dimension standards, site dimension standards that really are probably the actual components that need to be addressed. When we talk about flexibility and when we talk about the need to actually adequately reflect this land use map, in Brian Woodley's phrasing, this land use map looks pretty good, but are we actually hitting the outcomes that are desirable from this land use map? When we say things like neighborhood commercial, why aren't all of those zoning districts mixed use neighborhood, for example? Or if we say things like traditional neighborhood that says that there should be an interspersement of medium density housing options, what are the actual rules that are not allowing us to hit those goals? So when we do look at this more closely, as you all do ruminate on it, do try and look at what is the actual land use goal, and then are there some shortcomings that we can start to address as we consider zoning changes with this as well? Because we need the comprehensive plan to accurately advocate for those changes so that when we bring them forward to the Planning Commission, to the City Council, those types of changes can actually move forward. And I agree with some of the comments that this comprehensive plan does a really good job of that. So reiterating it in the next comprehensive plan is critical.
I think Luke did a great job of describing that. So the importance of this map, I don't think that we can emphasize how important it is, because let's say a developer comes in and says, I would really like to build a 30-unit large complex apartment, and we look to the future land use map to see if that is an appropriate rezone. That this is the first step. And if it's like, no, that is industrial and there can be no other use other than industrial, then it kind of is an uphill battle for planning to be able to advocate for that project. So that's why this map is so important, as Luke explained in a good manner. Yep.
We have to have that. We have to have that flexibility. I mean, there's, again, when you've only got so much land, And then you say, oh, by the way, in order to do a 2-bedroom apartment, you have to have 2,500 square feet. Do you really need 2,500 square feet? Probably not, but you have to be able to look at it and not have so many hoops to jump through. I mean, you know, time is money, money is time. And if projects take years and years and years, why even start? I think the other thing we have to look at is, this is different than zoning, but I think Brian talked about this. The cost of developing land now has become astronomical. There's some good projects that have been withdrawn because it feasibly, it can't be done without the resources of the city. So one of the first projects we did, the city financed and assessed for those improvements. That's no longer a possibility. And I guess we have to ask ourselves as a city, do we want development? And if we do, the city needs to be involved. If the city doesn't want to be involved, then certainly new development for housing is not going to be, it won't come around because it's just too expensive.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it. And definitely appreciate the comments related to flexibility as well, because I think especially, you know, considering the challenges that we have with development that have come up between 2007 and now, it's all the much more important that there is that flexibility involved. And so maybe that's one thing that we could point members of this committee to take a look at between this meeting and the next meeting. When you're taking a look at each of these categories, for instance, what are ways in which they could be a little bit more flexible? And I'll give one example here. So we have a designation that I have up on the screen. It's called general commercial. And this general commercial designation is primarily applied along Highway 61. You'll see it in what you think of as the commercial areas of the city. So around the Walmart Menards area, around the Hy-Vee area, you know, basically where the highways kind of come together, but it's along Highway 61. And you'll notice that it's one section of this description here says specifically no residential uses in these general commercial areas. But taking a look at these areas, what's a good place to have a residential use? Well, maybe right next to a place where they can walk to the hospital or walk to the pharmacy or walk to Target. And so you'll see this designation here where I think personally that there could be a lot more flexibility in this land use classification. And we have been able to work with our zoning because when it comes to greater Minnesota, the bottom line is the zoning code. We look to the comprehensive plan when it comes to rezoning, and we have to make a really good case to not go with the comprehensive plan, but bottom line when it comes down to use of property is zoning. So one thing that we have been able to do is if the zoning code allows residential right next to a commercial area, we have allowed the residential to go in that area that's designated for commercial. So for instance, in this general commercial area, it's the bright red.
Morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Good, good.
Good morning.
Weston's still sleeping, so I'll just hang out upstairs until he wakes up.
So that general commercial area is this bright red here, and you can see it. You know, one of the best examples is what I was getting at just a couple seconds ago, just east of Mankato, where we have the 55 and up developments there, located in an area that, you know, you may think that at first, what are they doing there? You know, why would people want to live in this area where, you know, but then when you think about it, hey, they're right next to the park, they're right next to the hospital, they're right next to all these amenities here. And are there opportunities for not just adjacent to the hospital, which is zoned R3, which that's what allows the residential uses to go in there, but throughout this red area to have multifamily housing or some type of housing to be able to have people to be located where the amenities are. So that's one example that I would point at in terms of flexibility where we think that there may be some opportunity here. Lucy?
Thank you, Carlos. And staff probably knows this. We had 3 subcommittee meetings yesterday, including economic development and housing and an accessible government, and we're having this meeting today. There's some overlap here. For example, in the housing subcommittee yesterday, it was brought up that some of the areas, let's say behind Walmart or Menards, which are zoned commercial, couldn't you have like a retail development perhaps with upper stories of residential, and being more flexible with that? And it has come up in other subcommittees. Are we going to talk later about low density housing? Because that seems kind of like a oxymoron and what everything else we're hearing. Or in the urban expansion, is that one of the next topics?
You hit it right on the head. So thank
Okay.
you for the transition. So the next example that I was going to look at, and we did talk about expansion areas south of Winona, and that's correct. The city doesn't have anywhere to go except for south in terms of physical expansion. So one of the areas that staff-wise that we've been focusing on, of course, is how the plan currently designates land to the south of us as specific residential categories or mixed use categories. So if you're taking a look at the land to the south of the city of Winona, you have the city kind of designated by the line here, and then some of the developments, like such as the Phillips development and Valley Oaks in this location. But then extending south from the city proper, we have these specific designations. So we have low density, which really relates to low density housing, mixed residential, business park, and general mixed use. And so what we have been interested in doing is that in these areas, taking a look at, instead of having these, for lack of a better term, blobs of specific types of development, having the ability to designate development corridors. So for instance, there would be a corridor on 44, a corridor on 43, and a corridor on 17. For instance, 44 in that corridor, or Garvin Heights Road as you go south, instead of having these general blobs of low density housing, so you have to have low density until you get out to this mixed residential or to this business park to have any type of commercial use. Would there be the opportunity for small scale commercial or even limited industrial in these areas? And limited industrial are things that where you have some type of manufacturing in these areas, but they don't impact the surrounding lands. So think about like tool and die or anything that happens inside a specific building or a structure, and you don't have a lot of external activity. And uses that complement similar agricultural uses that you find in this area. So I, for instance, think of the equestrian center, where you have a large building, a lot of traffic at specific time periods, but it fits within that agricultural area. So how can we potentially loosen up or provide some more flexibility in these expansion areas to allow for uses similar to that, or uses similar to the dairies or some of the other farm operations that are in that area that aren't just farmed agricultural land, that see a little bit more use and see a little bit more traffic. In addition to that, taking a look at, for instance, the Highway 17 corridor, and you'll see that that is all designated as low density. And that was one thing that came up with the recent co-op development that we were talking about next to the golf course, is they had to come in for a comprehensive plan change in addition to zoning and a litany of other things in order to proceed with that project, or to provide a roadmap for moving that project forward. And so in that area, could we allow for a mix of different styles of residential uses? So we would see that as more of a residential corridor, but allowing a number of different residential uses, not just low density. So we're not saying that we're going to put up, apartment buildings or anything like that, in the area, right off the highway. But if you have a larger subdivision, similar to what was being proposed as part of the co-op project, could you have a component of that is a higher density, that does have that co-op housing, or that does have some apartment style or attached units in it, that allows the development to hopefully be financially feasible, while at the same time providing more housing choice for people. So if they want to live in some of these areas south of the city that offer that more of suburban style setting in the bluffs, that you can live there and not have to buy a really large house on a big piece of property.
So just a real life example of you know, the limitations of the low density. So we did have Cedar Brook Cooperative Housing. They were looking at 40 units. They had a waiting list of people ready to move in. They had to go through a process of a comprehensive plan, text amendment, plan amendment, rezoning. And then when the density became an issue at the different public hearings, they were proposing a 4-story building with 40 units, and that didn't pass. They came back with a 3-story with 27 or 28 units. So they were limited in what they could do. That development by Bradford Development is not proceeding. That's not going to happen anymore. And there were many challenges with it, but the developer said one of the main issues was that they didn't have enough units to spread their costs out among. And so here's a real life example how perhaps that density issue, you know, that was a $14 million project. There were other reasons, construction costs, interest, et cetera, but one of them was the density. So.
And where was that?
Right across from Signatures.
Top of that, as a result, the old townhouse project.
Sorry.
As a result of that, though, the townhouse development that was going to go along with it, without that to start it, that's not going to get developed either. So not only did you lose 40 units, but then you lost another 30 townhouses.
Yep.
So now you're looking at 70 units, which is a lot. I mean, that's huge towards the housing that we need for the area.
And to add to that, I want to tie in a few comments that came in early on as well. When we talk about residential development, we talk about neighborhood development, and this is even spelled out a little bit later on in the land use section and section 4 on new neighborhood planning and design. We want to talk about holistic neighborhoods that do incorporate things like small commercial shops, so that not everybody has to drive down Mankato Avenue. And when we have it in construction, everybody's backed up for 45 minutes. And we talk about in the current comprehensive plan as well, the interconnected neighborhood idea of making sure that we do have gridded streets so that people, when you do have construction, you have redundancy for the ability to do so. And then I want to tie in what Councilmember Young mentioned, which is what is the efficiency of our land use? Right now, it's about $1.88 million for a half mile of road and utilities. That's a linear cost that's going to apply regardless of what you put on either side for private investment of that street. So when we designate something only for low density residential, will the city of Winona ever receive enough taxable revenue to justify that infrastructure cost, the future maintenance of that cost, and the replacement of that cost? So when we talk about growth and expansion of our community, it does behoove us as a committee to also think about the overall return on investment of public infrastructure. Because if we aren't making ourselves richer, we're either subsidizing that future growth or we're going to be finding ways to pay for it in the future with grants or additional debt.
And that's an important point, Luke. And I think that our speaker that we have on June 21st will kind of hit on that a little bit and provide a good summary of how he's approached that throughout in Minnesota and then throughout the United States as well. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes here, but pretty much that sums up what I wanted to cover for today. Again, for the next meeting, we'd be looking for you to take a look at these categories here and suggest areas for flexibility that you think might be able to happen. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to come in and talk to Luke and I, because we could definitely, with even just 15 minutes, help you to kind of work through this a little bit more if you have specific questions. And so John does have a question here.
Yes, looking at residential, we have low density, traditional, mixed, urban. What's the difference between low density and traditional and mixed residential?
Definitely. So part of what we see that we think we might be able to do is, instead of having all these classifications, is collapse some of them. And so we don't have as many. Yep. So that would be another thing to take a look at. I don't want to put too much of a burden on y'all, but if there are some that you think could be collapsed or combined together, that would be another thing to take a look at. Did you have something to say, John?
Yeah, what is the difference between low density and traditional?
Sure. We have it. We have it right here. So low density is in the city's urban expansion area, so areas to the south of the city, and it's development that is in areas that are constrained environmentally. And so essentially what it's recommending for these areas are relatively large houses on large lots. Traditional neighborhood, medium density, is what we would classify as 1 to 4 units being on a parcel of property. And that characterizing the core area of the city of Winona. In addition to that traditional neighborhood, right now we talk about traditional neighborhood just being residential uses with a number of, neighborhood parks, schools, churches, home businesses, that type of thing. But over and beyond that, we have a lot of neighborhood commercial uses that are currently nonconformities, such as, I'll just throw it out there, the high and low, Poots, some of our favorite neighborhood bars, and, some places that really make, yeah, exactly, these places that really make Winona. And, that's another opportunity, I think, for flexibility, especially in the traditional neighborhood area. How can we re-legalize these uses? People may not know, but technically these uses are legal nonconformities. So if for some reason they ever went out of play for over a year, there would be some backing in the code or in regulation to say that they couldn't go back. So if something happened that they went away for a long period of time, it would be hard to bring these things back. Well, I think we all realize the benefit that places like Blado's, Flowers on Broadway, and some of these small, commercial areas bring to not just the residential area surrounding that specific business, but really the city as a whole. So that's another example of flexibility. But getting back to your question, John, low density is large homes, large lots. Traditional neighborhood is 1 to 4 family units on a piece of property.
But in a traditional neighborhood, zoned R1, you could not put up a fourplex.
That's correct. Yep.
Well, then it isn't. It isn't what you say it is. You can't do what you say you can do.
I think this is a really good example of the need to update the zoning code to maybe more accurately reflect, and that should be coming out of this committee, more accurately reflect what we want from the land use plan. If the traditional neighborhood is going to, which does make up the predominant amount of land in the core of our city, if the intent is to actually have or allow for higher density residential uses, even medium density residential uses, or I would even go so far as to say the federal government will allow you to take out a standard conventional loan for up to 4 units. They consider that single family. Why are we being more prescriptive or more restrictive?
Yeah, you look at large cities, Minneapolis, my understanding is R1 is kind of going away. And I think we have to look at that too. In order to maximize the possibility of more housing units, you're going to have higher density, and you can't have high density with low density residential. Sorry, that's particularly on the island. It's got to change.
Sounds efficient.
Well, how else are you going to do it? I mean,
but I'm thinking of the neighbors who are in their single family homes looking.
Let's go ahead and grab our microphone so that everybody else can participate here.
That those zonings are on purpose because you're going to get a heck of a lot of complaints from a person like me when I'm in a single family residential neighborhood and all of a sudden someone says, I'm going to buy my neighbor's property, tear it down and build a 4-unit complex. I'm not going to be happy about that.
Exactly. And Steve, go ahead.
But when it's, I hear you. I get it. When it's maybe a twin home, when it's maybe a duplex, I understand that. Building a 4-unit commercial looking building would likely be objectionable and may not fit with that neighborhood. But I do think we need to be open that maybe a duplex is appropriate, a residential style. We've got to gain this efficiency to have the outcome we want to have. Agreed that the 2.5 story commercial looking box style building is probably not appropriate.
And this might be an opportunity to jump in and talk about how when we are creating the future land use map, when we talk about zoning codes, those are the foundational documents that allow private industry and private money to come in to potentially achieve a goal. But one of the things that we do need to talk about is things like building code that the city of Winona is not going to be able to effectively change because it's set by the state of Minnesota. And so when we say, hey, maybe we allow fourplexes everywhere, there's actually a difference. You'd go from the International Residential Code once you go above 3 units to the IBC, which is the business code. And so you end up having to sprinkle your buildings, and it increases the overall cost of building those buildings. So a lot of people aren't actually ever going to attempt to build those buildings. Similarly, as soon as you go above a certain amount of height, you're pumping water higher and higher. It will require larger investment. So you actually aren't going to see a larger assumption of those higher densities if you do begin to allow them. What that percentage is, we don't know because we don't allow those densities. Is it 1%? Is it 5%? What percentage of those buildings or these lots actually do want to see higher density? How much demand actually is there? And by opening it up, you do allow it to maybe begin to be realized. And Brian Woodley has his hand raised.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what everybody was talking about the higher density structures in the traditional areas. And maybe it's a situation where you want to make those allowable with a conditional use permit. And that way, each individual project can be looked at independently if it's a good fit for that area or not. And then the public has the opportunity to come to a public hearing, voice things. And in the end, you can see, well, perhaps on this block, it's not a good fit to have a fourplex, but on the next one over it is. And that process would allow that vetting to go forward.
Definitely, Brian. And when it comes to this, what I want to caution us to say is that we're not necessarily saying that, right next to, for instance, my house in the core area of Winona, there's going to be a quad right next to it. What we want to be able to do is to allow for changes that increase housing choice or increase density, but fit the character of the neighborhood. And that's primarily one of the main things that we heard from people in the first phase of public engagement is that people love Winona's small town character, small town feel. We may not be a small town per se, but they like the feel of it. And how do we preserve that character, not just of the whole city, but of neighborhoods, while allowing for additional housing choice. So when we talk about increased density, what we're talking about is for instance, owner-occupied dwelling units. So, instead of just a single-family home, you allow a duplex as long as it's owner-occupied. Or if you have a single-family home, you can have an accessory dwelling unit where somebody can live in the back. And perhaps, as we alluded to earlier, that doesn't have to comply with the 30% rule as long as there's an owner-occupant on that property. And in addition, if you're looking at uses where there's more than, for instance, 2 units, having a gradation in uses. So going from a single family to a duplex to a triplex. So you don't have that juxtaposition of a single family home right next to something that has a significant larger amount of units. So I also think that that's another opportunity for our land use plan here, is to provide for some transitional zones. You'll see that if you take a look at this map, there's a lot of times a hard line down the middle of a street between one zone and another zone. For instance, I'll just talk about the Winona State University area. So right across Huff Street, we say that that's traditional neighborhood, which, yes, it is composed of residential structures, and the university is on the other side. But the character of the area immediately surrounding the university for at least a couple of blocks is significantly different than when you go a few blocks further. So what are some opportunities that we might be able to say, hey, in these areas, can we have a transitional zoning that provides more flexibility in terms of uses? Maybe some small scale commercial in these areas, maybe some opportunities for increased density in these areas, just recognizing that the character is different when you transition from one side of the street to the other, and it doesn't just stop at the middle of the street. There's a gentle undulation, as Luke likes to say, in terms of how uses work together and the character of the areas.
The central school, forget about the street. It was halfway through the school. One half was R2 and the other half was R3. Caused problems on what you could do with the school. So yeah, there's lots of areas like that.
I don't want to draw us away from really good conversation. This is really good conversation. I do want to recognize that we are only a couple of minutes away from our hour of time here, though. And before we do have people start dropping off, because I noticed that Rick had to go, I do want to set our next meeting date for this group. Ideally, we'd be looking about 2 weeks out. That would be the 9th of June. That's a Thursday. Does 8:30 in the morning continue to work for all of you? I'm seeing some head nods. Any objections? All right, we will go ahead and plan on 8:30 in the morning on the 9th. And then I also want to draw your attention to the 21st of June. We intend for the 21st of June to have a featured speaker coming in. His name is Chuck Marone. He's the founder of Strong Towns. Strong Towns is a nationwide movement to address efficient development patterns for cities. So getting back to exactly what Councilmember Young was talking about, and also what many of you were all talking about, how can we have good return on public investment? How can we make sure that when we say that we want gentle density or we want to have higher density, that it's reflective of the character of our communities? So he really is an expert. He's an urban planner and a civil engineer, and he's been able to really start pushing the boundaries and leading in the direction for urban planning going forward. So the 21st, that's going to be at 6:30 p.m. It'll be open to the public, and we'll invite all the subcommittee members. And then tentatively, we are also planning an 11:30 in the morning where we will invite subcommittee members. That 11:30 will be over Zoom as well. So those who are not able to make it during the day can do so. But I will send out that information as soon as we have all of those dates locked down.
Okay, that's all that we have for today. And Mike, go ahead. Did you have something?
Somewhat related to this, but probably not part of our charge. I mean, has the dust really settled in terms of student housing in Winona? COVID has had a tremendous impact on it, and we all learned that we can do distance learning. Are we seeing an impact that way? And does that affect how we use our residential neighborhoods? Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. That's a great question. And perhaps we can give some more perspective on that at our next meeting. I think our housing and neighborhoods task force will take a look at that, and it definitely came up there. Yep. So we can, and that's the thing. Each one of these subcommittees doesn't exist in a silo. There's stuff that happens across of them. So we'll try to bring you up to speed on what other committees are talking about specifically related to that. But thank you, everybody. Take a look at those zoning, or take a look at those land use designations, and let us know potential areas for flexibility for the next meeting. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good day.
High density.
Sure.
So
It's the light brown.
oh, urban residential. Is that what you're looking for? Yeah, sorry. So urban residential. Yep, right here, down here, right here. Right over here.
Down there.